I have been the sexton of St. Martin's Church for 36 years, and in that time, I have swept the nave, wound the clock, dug the graves, polished the brass, and kept every secret that a church accumulates, which is more secrets than most people imagine, because a church is the one place where people believe they are alone with God, and they forget that the sexton is always there. My name is Ezra Crouch. I am 60 years old, and the one secret I kept longer than any other, 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days, was the book on the third pew from the back, and the 2 people who wrote in it without ever knowing they were writing to each other. I should explain the book. It appeared on a Tuesday in October, 3 years before the events I am about to describe. A small leather-bound notebook, brown, unadorned, placed on the seat of the third pew from the back on the left side of the nave, the pew nearest the door, the pew that no regular parishioner claimed, the pew where strangers sat. Inside the front cover, in a neat, careful hand, someone had written, "If you find this book, write something true. Leave it for the next person. Let us be honest with strangers, since we cannot seem to be honest with anyone else." I found it on Wednesday morning when I swept the pews. I read the inscription. I put the book back. On Thursday, someone had written beneath it, something true. I am lonely in a way that has nothing to do with being alone. I am surrounded by people who know my name, and none of them know me. On Friday, in a different hand, smaller, rounder, written in ink rather than pencil, something true. I teach children to read, and every evening I go home to a house where there is no one to talk to, and the silence is not peaceful. It is the loudest thing I have ever heard. The book stayed. I do not know why I did not remove it. A sexton's duty is to keep the church tidy, and an anonymous notebook left on a pew is not tidy. But I read the entries, and what I read was not litter. It was 2 people, strangers, writing on alternate days, telling each other things they could not tell anyone else. And the honesty of it was so unexpected and so raw that removing the book felt like an act of vandalism against something sacred. The 2 writers never came at the same time. One came in the morning, early, before the church was open, through the vestry door that I left unlocked for the flower ladies. This was the Duke. I knew because I saw him once, through the vestry window, sitting in the third pew at 6:30 in the morning, writing. The Duke of Clarefield was 33 years old, intellectual, reclusive, and, I had observed over 7 years of his attendance at St. Martin's, profoundly isolated in the particular way that powerful men are isolated, which is to say that he was surrounded by people who wanted things from him, and had no one who wanted nothing except his honesty. The other came in the afternoon after the school day ended. This was Phoebe Ward. I knew because I saw her too, a young woman of 25, the village school teacher, sitting in the same pew at 4 o'clock, reading what the morning writer had left and adding her own words beneath. Phoebe was brown-haired, quiet, sharp-minded, and she had the particular loneliness of a woman who is too intelligent for her circumstances and too proud to complain about it. She had been the school teacher for 3 years, having come from a larger town to take the position when no one else would, and she lived alone in the schoolhouse cottage, and the silence she had written about in her first entry was not an exaggeration. It was the truest thing in the book. They wrote to each other for 3 years. They wrote about loneliness and silence, and the difference between being known and being understood. They wrote about books. The Duke favored the Greeks. Phoebe favored the novels of Miss Austen, and their arguments about whether Aristotle or Elizabeth Bennet better understood human nature filled 7 pages, and were, I thought, the finest literary criticism produced in the county. They wrote about the village, the Duke describing it from above as a pattern of fields and lanes and lives that he managed but did not inhabit. Phoebe describing it from within as a collection of children who could not spell, and parents who could not pay, and a schoolhouse that leaked when it rained, and a garden that grew the best runner beans in the district, despite the soil being mostly clay. They wrote about themselves, not their names, never their names, but the shapes of their lives. The Duke wrote about inheriting an estate at 25 and discovering that wealth was the most effective form of loneliness ever invented, because it surrounded you with people who saw the estate and not the man. Phoebe wrote about choosing to teach in a village where no one read the books she read, or thought the thoughts she thought, and about the slow, quiet erosion of a mind that has no one to sharpen itself against. There was one exchange, in the second winter, that I have never forgotten. The Duke wrote about his mother, who had died when he was 19. A long entry, the longest he had written, about sitting beside her bed in the final hours, and holding her hand, and realizing that he had never told her a single true thing about himself, because the habits of privacy had already set in, and her death had sealed them shut. I have spent 14 years regretting the words I did not say, he wrote, and the cruelest part is that I still cannot say them. I am writing them to you, a stranger, because you are the only person I have ever been honest with, and you do not even know my name. Phoebe's response filled 2 pages. She wrote about her own mother, who had died when Phoebe was 12, and about the years afterward, growing up in her aunt's house, learning to be quiet, because quiet girls were easier to keep, learning to read, because books did not require her to be grateful for the space they occupied. She wrote, "You say you cannot say the words. You just did. You said them to me, and I heard them, and they are not too late. The dead do not need our honesty. The living do, and you have given yours to a stranger in a notebook, which means the words are not locked inside you. They are here, on this page, and I am reading them, and they are the bravest thing anyone has ever written to me." They were, I realized by the end of the first year, falling in love. They were falling in love with words on a page, with honesty offered to a stranger, with the extraordinary intimacy of being truly known by someone whose face they had never seen. The Duke's entries grew longer, more personal, more vulnerable. Phoebe's grew warmer, funnier, more willing to risk the kind of observations that a schoolteacher does not share with her employer or her neighbors. They made each other braver on paper than they were in the world, which is, I believe, what love is for. I said nothing. I kept the book on the pew. I kept the secret. I told myself it was not my business, which was true, and that they would find each other eventually, which I hoped was true, and that the book was doing something that I, a sexton, a gravedigger, a man who swept floors, could not do and should not interfere with, which was also true. They almost met twice. Once, in the second year, Phoebe came early, 3 o'clock instead of 4, and the Duke was still in the churchyard, walking among the gravestones the way he sometimes did after writing. She sat in the pew and began reading, and the Duke was 30 yards away, and if he had turned and walked back inside, he would have seen her. He did not turn. He walked to his horse and rode home. And Phoebe read his entry, a long passage about the particular pain of wanting to be known by someone who already knows you better than anyone alive, without either of you being able to cross the distance between the page and the world. And she wrote beneath it, "I think I would know you if I saw you. I think I have been looking for your face without knowing it, but I am afraid that the real you will be smaller than the you who writes, and that the real me will disappoint the you who reads, and that meeting will destroy the only honest thing I have." The Duke read that entry the following morning. He sat in the pew for a long time afterward. Then he wrote, "You could not disappoint me. The person who writes these words is not smaller than the words. She is larger. I have spent 3 years reading her, and she has grown with every page, and I am afraid of the same thing you are afraid of. That meeting will end what we have, but I am more afraid of never meeting, because a life spent writing to someone I love without ever seeing her face is not a life. It is a letter that never arrives." The second near meeting was in the 3rd year. Phoebe dropped her glove in the pew, a brown woolen glove, mended at the thumb, and the Duke found it the next morning. He held it for a long time. He wrote, "I found your glove. It is mended at the thumb. The stitching is careful and small, and tells me that you are a person who repairs things, rather than replacing them. I am keeping the glove. I will return it when I know your name. If you want it back before then, leave me yours." Phoebe wrote, "Keep the glove. It is the warmest thing I own, but the entries you leave are warmer. My name is a risk I am not ready to take. But I will tell you this. I walk past your horse every morning on my way to the school. He is a gray gelding, and he waits very patiently. You should know that I have been feeding him an apple every Tuesday, and he has come to expect it. And if you and I never meet, your horse and I will have had a longer courtship than most marriages." I laughed when I read that. I am not ashamed to say it. I laughed in an empty church, reading a schoolteacher's love letter to a duke she had never met, about a horse she had been feeding apples. It was the funniest and most tender thing in the book, and it was at that moment that I decided the secret had gone on long enough. I did not tell them. I am a sexton, not a matchmaker. But I did something I had never done in 36 years of service. I changed the clock. St. Martin's clock, the clock I had wound every week for 3 decades, ran 4 minutes fast. I knew this. The village knew this. Everyone adjusted. On the Tuesday after I read the glove entry, I adjusted the clock by 12 minutes, making it 16 minutes fast. Phoebe, who set her schedule by the church clock, arrived at the church at 3:45 by the clock, which was, in reality, 3:30. The Duke, who set his schedule by his own pocket watch, was still in the pew. I waited in the bell tower. I had been winding the mechanism, or pretending to wind it, since it did not need winding for another 3 days. And from the tower rail I could see the nave below, the rows of pews, the pale afternoon light through the east window, and the Duke of Clarefield, sitting in the 3rd pew, with the notebook open and his pen moving across the page. He wrote slowly, as he always did, pausing between sentences the way a man pauses when he is choosing between the truth and a lesser version of the truth, and deciding, each time, on the truth. I could not read what he wrote from that height, but I could see the care of it in the angle of his hand and the stillness of his shoulders. The vestry door opened. I heard it before I saw her, the creak of the iron latch, the scuff of boots on stone, and then Phoebe walked into the nave carrying a stack of primers she had been marking, her brown hair coming loose from its pins, the way it always did by the end of the school day. And she was already looking toward the 3rd pew, because the 3rd pew was where she always looked first. She saw the Duke. She stopped. The primers slid sideways in her arms, and she caught them without looking away from the man in the pew. He heard the sound of the primers shifting and looked up. I was in the bell tower, watching through the rail, and I saw them see each other for the first time. The Duke of Clarefield and Phoebe Ward, the 2 people who had been writing the most honest words in the county to each other for 3 years without ever meeting, and the expression on their faces was identical. It was the expression of 2 people who have just discovered that the stranger they love is not a stranger at all. "You," Phoebe said. "You," the Duke said. "You are the one who writes about Aristotle. You are the one who feeds my horse apples." She sat down in the pew beside him. She sat down the way she did everything, directly, without ceremony, without adjusting herself for rank. And she said, "You wrote that meeting might destroy the only honest thing we have." I was wrong. I have been wrong about many things, but I was most wrong about that. How do you know? Because you walked through the door 30 seconds ago, and you are not smaller than your words. You are exactly the size I imagined, and the size I imagined was very large. She looked at the notebook, their notebook, 3 years of honesty, the truest conversation either of them had ever had, and she said, "I have been afraid that the real you would be smaller than the you who writes." Am I? She looked at him for a long time, this quiet, reclusive, supposedly unknowable Duke who had written 3 years of loneliness and longing and literary criticism in a notebook on a church pew, and she said, "No, you are exactly the same. The words and the man are the same size. That is the rarest thing I have ever encountered." They did not leave the church that afternoon. They sat in the pew for 2 hours, talking, actually talking, face to face, voice to voice. And I stayed in the bell tower, because leaving would have meant walking through the nave and interrupting, and some things a sexton does not interrupt. They talked about the entries. They quoted them to each other, his words in her voice, her words in his, and the sound of their own honesty, spoken aloud by the person it had been written for, was, I think, the most intimate thing either of them had experienced. He came to the school the following day. He stood at the back of the classroom while Phoebe taught the children their letters, and afterward, he walked her home to the schoolhouse cottage, and she made tea, and they sat in her kitchen and argued about Elizabeth Bennet for 45 minutes. He came back the next day, and the next. He brought her a volume of Greek philosophy, Plato's Symposium, on the nature of love, and she read it in one evening, and told him the next morning that Plato was wrong about love being the search for a missing half, because she was not half a person, and neither was he, and love was not about completion, but about finding someone whose wholeness matched your own. The Duke said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "That is the truest thing anyone has ever said to me, and you said it to my face instead of writing it in a notebook, which means we have made progress." He proposed in the church. He proposed sitting in the third pew from the back, holding the brown notebook, and he said, "I have spent 3 years writing to you, because I did not know how to speak to you. I know now. Phoebe Ward, you are the only person who has ever known me. Not the Duke, not the estate, not the title. Me, the man who writes about Aristotle and keeps your glove in his desk drawer and whose horse likes you better than he likes me. Will you marry me so that I can stop writing and start speaking, because I have a great deal more to say, and I would rather say it to your face than to a page. Your Grace, I am a school teacher who lives in a cottage with a leaking roof, and I am a duke who lives in a house with 40 rooms, none of which contain a single person who knows me. Your cottage has you in it. My house has silence. I know which I prefer." They married in January in St. Martin's, and I wound the clock back to its proper 4 minutes fast, and the book, the brown notebook, 3 years of honesty between strangers who were never truly strangers, sat on the third pew during the ceremony, because Phoebe insisted, and the Duke agreed, because the book was where they had begun, and the church was where they had found each other, and the sexton who had kept the secret for 3 years stood at the back and thought about clocks and gloves and apples, and the extraordinary, stubborn, patient fact that 2 lonely people had found each other through nothing but words, and that the words had been, in the end, enough.